Hello, I see people are getting a little coffee and little treats and come to the tables. Wow. Good morning and welcome, welcome, welcome. It's fantastic to see all of your faces here. How exciting. My name is Deborah Love, and I'm in charge of the Office of Institutional Equity here at Tulane University. And I'm also the assistant to the president on his diversity initiative. So I partner with him in working towards enhancing diversity at Tulane University. On behalf of Tulane University and my office, I welcome you. This is the second summit, the second Race and Poverty Summit. The first summit I attended, and it was absolutely fabulous. We had a fabulous speaker, and the participants really, gave so much of their time and their souls and gave us so much information. And I know this summit will be just as great or even greater. I know that we have some really distinguished community people in the audience today. That's absolutely fantastic. And Tulane faculty and staff and friends from the community. I'm so excited to see all of you here. I would like to meet each and every one of you. It is so important that my office connect with you. So again, welcome, welcome, welcome. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Chason at this moment, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, good morning again, and welcome to this Multiracial Coalition Building Forum. We're really pleased to see you, and we sincerely hope that this meeting is going to be meaningful to you, and we hope, will certainly benefit you and the community in terms of pulling together, developing, establishing, and maintaining a multiracial and multi-ethnic coalition in New Orleans. I want to acknowledge the Ford Foundation as the primary sponsor of this event, primary funding sponsor. For those of you who are not as familiar with the Institute for the Study of Race and Poverty, that institute has been funded by the Ford Foundation for 1 year right now. It's a planning grant, and this activity is a part of the planning activities so that we get feedback from you as well as develop some ways to really get some movement and some actions as it relates to structural racism and racialized poverty. 3 other groups helped to co-sponsor this event. One, the Partnership for the Transformation of Urban Communities here at Tulane University, and that is funded by the MacArthur Foundation. Dr. Joel Devine is director of that institute, and Joel is somewhere around here. He can just raise his hand so you can see Joel. And the Initiative for Regional and Community Transformation in Rutgers in New Jersey is also co-sponsoring. And the Office of Peace and Justice with Catholic Charities, the Archdiocese of New Orleans, is another co-sponsor. Currently, the Archdiocese is conducting their own racial harmony implementation meeting this morning from 9 to 12 at the same time that ours is. So it's good to know that there are 2 things going on in New Orleans right now where we're really working to look at racial and ethnic harmony. I also want to acknowledge members of the Community Advisory Board who are here this morning. And if you could just stand so that we know you. I know Sister Lori is here, and Sister Lori has been a big support. Orlando Watkins is here. Just Lee Hampton, any others, Patrice, Sam Zabuddin, thank you so much for coming. Also, the staff of the Office of the Institute of Race and Poverty are here, and Nina Cooper is our administrative assistant, so you've gotten lots of emails from Nina, and we continue to want to inform you and send things out to you. Verna Barnett is our community liaison, and Verna is back there, and she will be working with you this morning as well. Verna, if you could let people know who you are. Thank you. We also have work study students who will ask to stand at another point, but we could have Lindsay and Liz stand in the back, and we have some in the front of the door. They're waving to you there. We all want to work with you this morning to make this a comfortable and productive meeting for you. We have group facilitators at each table. If group facilitators could please stand so that you will know who is going to facilitate a discussion and dialogue. Great, thank you. Some of the feedback that we received from the last summit was that people really wanted more time to discuss and to dialogue about some of these issues. So we really want to honor that. The other important thing, I guess a couple of other important things, is that the bathrooms are over here. get out, you can get through the front door and you go out this way in order to get bathrooms. We have water and juice and other breakfast things in the back, and we're ordering more cream and so on. Let us know if you need something to make you more comfortable. We'll be glad to do it. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce our guest speaker, Maya Wiley. And Maya actually has agreed to come to us today without an honorarium or any kind of compensation, and we just feel very honored and very blessed that someone like Maya is here with us this morning. I called Maya, and with one phone call, she agreed to come. It sounds like a commercial, I know. You hear these, just one phone call, and that's all, and that's Maya said that she would come. One of the things that I met Maya actually in January, at least heard her speak, and I was so impressed with the passion that she has about multiracial coalition building. And in looking at her website, Maya is currently director of the Center for Social Inclusion. She's the founder and director of the center, and that center is a national policy advocacy organization which works to dismantle structural racism. She is a civil rights attorney and policy advocate, a graduate from Columbia University School of Law in 1989. She received a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College in 1986. She's litigated, lobbied U.S. Congress, and developed programs to transform structural racism in the United States and South Africa. Prior to founding the Center for Social Inclusion, Ms. Wiley was a senior advisor on race and poverty to the director of U.S. programs of the Open Society, and helped develop and implement the Open Society Foundation, South Africa's criminal justice initiative. She's worked for the American Civil Liberties Union, in the National Legal Department, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, in the Poverty and Justice Program, and the Civil Division of the United States Attorney Office for the Southern District of New York. We have a lot of information. We have a sheet on Maya at your table so that you could read a little bit more about her. There's so many things that she's done, but I want you to really spend the time hearing what Maya has to say. You have packets or information at your table so that whatever Maya is saying this morning, you should have a PowerPoint document right at your place, setting wherever you're sitting right now. A fact sheet on the Institute for Race and Poverty and other kinds of documents. But I want to go ahead and introduce and have Maya come up here so that she can begin. One word, the agenda is also, should be on your desk now, and at least on the tables in front of you, so that you could kind of track what we're doing. We're starting a little bit late, but we'll work to catch up so that we get you out of here at about 12:15 today. Thank you, and hope this is really a productive meeting. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Dr. Chasson. You know, it makes it sound like it's tough to get folk to come to New Orleans, and I swear it was easy, not just because of the food and the music, I swear. And I wasn't actually, this isn't actually part of my remarks, but I just wanted to say that Louisiana has been an extremely important place for me in terms of my own development in the field of racial justice, because as a young, fresh-faced attorney, newly minted out of Columbia Law School, one of my first jobs at the ACLU was to essentially come to Louisiana, work under the tutelage of someone you may know named Professor Bill Quigley at the Tulane Law School, and essentially try to create a lawsuit to improve the equity and financing of the public education system in the state. And as a result, I spent the better part of a year actually traveling around the state of Louisiana. My job was to look for plaintiffs. But I went to rural communities outside of Shreveport, places that I will admit I was not too comfortable driving at night by myself, a little worried about the racism. I talked with white parents whose students were suffering in rural school systems. I talked to black parents whose children were suffering in the urban school systems. And one of the things that was incredibly powerful about that experience was not just learning what was happening in Louisiana and the way that related to what was happening all over the country, but the fact that the structure of the public education system, which was largely built on race and racism, was actually crushing the opportunities of people all over the state, of all races, of all classes except for the upper classes. And I think that is a particularly powerful example of why we can, should, and must work together. And it was one of my early experiences with that, and I cut my teeth on it here in Louisiana. So what I'm going to talk about is, one thing I just want to say is I heard that there's a hurricane coming. Did y'all hear this? There's a hurricane coming, and the gale force winds are going to be more than 175 miles an hour. And the storm surge that hurricane is going to produce is going to be far greater than the 12 to 20 to 30 feet storm surges that came after Katrina, after Rita. Did y'all hear that? Did y'all hear about that hurricane? Well, that's the hurricane of hope. And that's the hurricane of hope that's going to be built upon the recognition that in this country we all share a desire for three things: opportunity, equality, and fairness. Those are actually nationally, culturally held values. And if we tap those values properly and think about what that represents across all our communities, we will produce a hurricane that Katrina, Rita, Wilma cannot possibly match, even if we pulled the gale force winds of all those hurricanes together. And I'm going to tell you why. I'll tell you a little bit about the center, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. What I'm really here to talk about is what is a multiracial alliance, why we need multiracial alliance, and some of what, I won't be arrogant enough to say I know all of the answers to the hows, but some of the hows about how we might produce those multiracial alliances. So who are we at the center? So we're trying to fan the winds of the hurricane. That's essentially who we are. And the way we do that is our mission is to dismantle structural racism. Some of you who heard John Powell's remarks at the last summit, we work very closely with John Powell. We use a very similar analysis. But essentially it's that our institutions, whether we have people who intend to discriminate, we know we still do, even if they didn't, we have set our institutions up like our education system, like the way we do our economic development, like the way we do health care in this country. We have set these systems up to exclude whole groups of people from the opportunities that they offer. And unfortunately, based on our history, a lot of that is driven by race. Even if today people say, we intend to make sure all of these services and benefits reach everyone. But with the current institutional systems that we have, it's very difficult to do that. We must transform that. So a lot of what we do is think about how we do that. And we do that in partnership with communities. We do that by trying to develop research and understanding and ideas about how these structures are creating barriers for communities of color, but we would also argue also barriers for all communities. We inform the public. We try to convene stakeholders to produce the policy advocacy solutions to some of these problems, and we nurture multiracial alliances. So everything we do in an effort to bring people together across groups and across as many racial groups as we possibly can. So that means supporting advocacy efforts that will lead us to the kind of America that produces opportunity for everyone, equality, and fairness. So what is a multiracial alliance? Because if you think about when people talk about it, they really are talking about several different things. So really what I want to say is the form of it is irrelevant. It can be a single organization. It can be multiple organizations working together that represent constituencies of different races. It can be relationships across communities. So when I'm talking about multiracial alliance, I'm not assuming the form. And I think that's important because a lot of people hear alliance or coalition, and they immediately start to think of a centralized structure in which there are member organizations that then has an administrative staff. And I'm here to tell you you can do it that way. There's no right or wrong. The importance of it is that it represents more than one group that's racially identified in the U.S. in the way we do race. I'll talk about that a little later. That frames the issues that it's working on in a way that is inclusive of the needs of all groups and recognizes the role that race is playing in driving the divisions and comes up with the frame and the solutions that drives the unity. And that can be done in many different ways and in many different forms. And what I would argue to you is the important thing is to think about those principles and then figure out the form that works best in the places that you're working. So what's the best form for New Orleans is not necessarily the best form that's in New York City or in Los Angeles, California, or in Waco, Texas. So I think the important thing is don't think of the form, think of the principles. So why multiracial alliance? Democracy, demographics, dismantling structural racism, and I will say what I mean by each one of those. So what is democracy? What is it? Democracy, if we properly understand democracy, is not just about the ballot box. Of course it includes the ballot box. Of course it includes whether we're able to make decisions about who our governors, our leaders are in our local areas. It might be in our communities, in our cities, in our counties, in our states, in our national government. But that's not the full definition of democracy. The full definition of democracy, I would argue, is the structure that promotes our ability to live together and collectively build our opportunities in a way that promotes, come on, y'all can say it with me by now, opportunity, equality, and fairness. So it's not just a process, although it must include democratic processes. And those democratic processes are not just electoral. So what do we mean when we talk about civic engagement or social capital? We're talking about the mechanisms by which we identify each other, figure out our needs, work together, support each other, and promote what we need to have a truly healthy community, a sustainable community, a healthy state, a sustainable state, a healthy country, a sustainable country. That is what democracy is. So what I would say to you is we cannot possibly, as a pluralistic society, as a society that is made up of people from Africa, people from England, people from Mexico, people from Bangladesh, we cannot possibly have a democracy unless we have mechanisms and frames and collectivity that supports a recognition that we are all not one people, we're all many peoples, many different cultures, but we are one community. And we do have shared need. And the needs of all of our communities will only be realized collectively. So, what that means is I'm talking about a substantive democracy. So now I'll turn to demographics. All right, so I don't have to tell you all. Like, if we look at the national statistics, 12% of this country is black, roughly. 12.1%, if you want to be specific about what the U.S. Census said in 2000. The Latino population, and that is a pan-ethnic population unto itself, but the Latino population is 12.5% of the nation. The Native American population is roughly 0.7%. The Asian population is roughly 3.7%. What happens when we put all those numbers together? We're suddenly not talking about 12% or 4% or 1%. We're talking about a substantial portion of the U.S. population. And now I'm only talking about people defined as people of color. If we look at the changing demographics of the country, and I know you all know this well too, by 2050, given the in-migration of people of color from what I will call the majority world, because the majority world is a non-white world, from the majority world, then what we see is that by 2050, we will probably, assuming the demographic trends, no longer be a majority white, and I'm using that term because that is also a racialized term, but white majority. We will be a majority of people of color. Latino population, pan-ethnic Latino population will be the largest segment. Okay? So if we just think about who we are then numerically and who we are more increasingly becoming, we must think about how we work across racial groups. But if we look at the metropolitan area statistics, it still holds up, even in cities like New Orleans, which have been majority black for a long time, right? And at least high percentage of black population. I'll get into that a little bit later because that demographic has not always been true either. But if we also look more broadly into the metropolitan statistical area, that becomes equally important because as we see in migration patterns pre-hurricane, a lot of immigrants were going to suburbs, not just the city. And there's also been out-migration from the city. The population of the city itself was actually not growing substantially before the hurricane. And a lot of that has to do with suburbanization patterns. But the point is, we need to start thinking of ourselves collectively outside our governance geography and more around our community geography. And I would argue that that means looking at the metropolitan area, not just the city itself. So what becomes extremely important when we talk about democracy and demographics? We can't understand why multiracial coalition is critical if we're going to survive and thrive as a nation unless we recognize the role that race is playing in creating our communities and in driving our divisions. And this is a structural problem. This is not just about personal attitudes and opinions. And this is fundamentally critical for us to understand. So, let's just think about how we do race in this country. The most important thing that we have to recognize about race is, one, it's a fiction. There is no such thing biologically as race. Oh, there are cultural differences, sure. There are linguistic groups, but there's no biological basis to race. There's no even arguably genetic basis to race, the social scientists tell us. So what do we mean when we say race? We're really talking about a social construction. And the reason that's important is it has never been static in this country. It has never been one definition. It has been a constantly changing definition. And I'll just give you a couple of historic examples. In the 60s, who knows the first corporation that formed in the United States? The very first U.S.-based corporation. Anybody have a guess? Or no? The Virginia colony. The Virginia colony was the first corporation in the United States. It was a corporation of the Crown of England. It came to be a profit-making engine for the Crown. And the governors of the Virginia colony were a corporate board. They were not elected. They represented the financial interests of the Crown, and that was their sole purpose. Now, the labor force that propelled that, of course, was indentured servants. And who were the indentured servants, by and large? White Brits. Not exclusively, but largely. White people from England. were treated like slaves. And the distinctions between Africans who are being brought, there were, of course, some critical distinctions, but actually, in the early Virginia colony, blacks, like indentured servants, had time contracts. So slavery wasn't a permanent condition. And the living conditions were not distinct between those early white indentured servants, who were not, by the way, considered white at that time. They weren't white. They were Christian. The distinction was Christian, pagan. That was the distinction. It took 70 to 75 years to create the racialized distinctions in the Virginia colony, driven by the interests of the Virginia colony in separating its labor pool to control its labor population. And by the way, the Virginia colony originally would have been happy to enslave Native Americans, and that was the original plan. But they couldn't do it because the native populations could escape. They knew the landscape better, they knew the territory better. If they had to run, they could do it. They could recede into their own lands, which you couldn't do if you were being brought over either on a slave ship or through indentured servitude. So very important structural distinctions in who they were even able to, and I'll say one other thing, really interesting fact that I was shocked when I read. The English government actually tried to enslave white people in 1583 and passed the law of the exchequer because they had a population problem and they had a poverty problem. So they created a legal mechanism by which you could enslave the peasantry. Now, the law only lasted for a few years because it was too reprehensible to the values of the country. But the point is, there were lots of efforts to enslave that were not driven by our current concept of race. That had to be built. And it had to be structured in, and it had to be structured in by a system of laws and by definitions of how you created the groups themselves. So white women, what became white women, because at this time these concepts didn't even apply. The servitude status of the children of couples that were in the early Virginia colony were driven ultimately then by the status of the woman. So English women bore children who were free of servitude, and African women bore children who were not. That was this fundamental structural legal change that did not start at the beginning of the colony. They developed it. And that structural difference helped produce the racial definitions of what became whiteness and black slavery, chattel slavery. I could go on and on because I think it's such a fascinating history and it tells us so much about ourselves. But let's turn to the nation's first immigration law. The first immigration law was in 1790. And what it said was, in order to be a citizen, you had to be white. That's basically what it said. But here's a fascinating thing. Who was white? Who was white? So this produced 100 years of trying to decide who was white. And guess who wasn't? Guess who wasn't white for 100 years? Italians, Yugoslavs, Greeks, and Irish were not white and did not deserve citizenship in this country. I think this is an extremely important history if we want to understand our immigration debate today. Because this notion of who belongs and who can be members of our democracy is completely arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary. And it has been for the short history of our country. So we went through a structural process in this country of creating systems that help sort people based on developing racial categories. There's even some history where in Los Angeles, for example, there was a debate about who was going to be white as they were trying to figure out, post-war with Mexico, well, you know, what happens with the Mexican population? And because whites wanted to actually control blacks, they said, well, we don't know if you're white, but we will tell you you're not black. I mean, these were the kinds of debates that we had in this country for 100 years, and we've forgotten that history already. Part of then what we have to think about is what our structures, and particularly our 20th century history, represents in the continuing saga of racializing us. So the two most, I'll just give you two examples, white suburbanization being the primary one. And I say white suburbanization intentionally because the systems, the laws, the incentives that the federal government and state government created for what became, started with the New Deal, but became really deeply, really took root after World War II, was the creation of the white suburbs. And they were intentionally created white. So, for instance, the Federal Home Administration, which created Federal Housing Administration, which was the first federal housing administration coming out of the New Deal, and the Veterans Administration guaranteed 50% of the mortgages, new mortgages for these suburban housing that was sprawling all over the country. And in order to get that mortgage, you had to be creating homogenous communities. So 50% of the mortgage subsidies of the country were racialized. The GI Bill, the biggest public benefit we've ever had in this country, which was fundamentally responsible for the production of the middle class as we know it today, was deeply racialized. Who was allowed to serve in the military? And even if you served, so you didn't get the benefits if you didn't serve in the military. Blacks and Latinos, by and large, and Asians as well, except for very small, important populations, were by and large not serving because they were segregated forces still. So the benefits were actually gerrymandered benefits. But not only that, those benefits drove who entered the middle class. So we had a system that continues to operate today, now unconsciously. At the time it was conscious, but now unconsciously, that is essentially saying we're going to call the playing field equal now, even though what we essentially did was have a huge affirmative action program for what we have now more recently pan-ethnicized as white. So now we no longer have Italian Americans and Irish Americans and German Americans and Slavs. We just have a process of suburbanization that helped create a pan-ethnic white identity. We actually de-ethnicize. It was a structure that helped de-ethnicize people from Europe who were highly ethnicized through most of the country's history. It was a fundamental assimilationist process. And except for the few places where those I live in New York, so we still have Italian-American identity in the city of New York because you still have physical Italian-American communities. So I don't mean it's been completely erased, but by and large, most of that has been driven by this suburbanization process. So the structures themselves produce what we think of as race, how we produce a hierarchy on race, and how that then drives the opportunities that we have based on that race. So, but we do have a hierarchy, because the one constant throughout this entire history that I've mentioned, the one constant after that first 75 years of the Virginia colony, was that blacks were not white. That was the only constant, and that blacks were the most inferior. So that was the only constant, and we have to be conscious of that as well. Because as we do multiracial work and we get explicit about how racial hierarchy is working and what it does to all our communities, we also have to be explicit about how the structures sort and give certain privileges to certain groups if they're willing to do certain kinds of assimilations, and there's certain groups that can't and won't be able to assimilate in the current structures. So we have to be conscious of how the structure is operating and how it works to divide us. And that means understanding that we are not in a black and white world at all in this country. But all people who are in this country are operating in a black-white paradigm that is extremely unhealthy for all racial groups. So we have to understand that as well. So space and racial hierarchy, I already talked about that a little bit, but let's look at what it did in New Orleans. So before 1970, New Orleans was actually a pretty multiracial city, but that multiracialness was also not highly segregated. I mean, New Orleans did not have the hyper-segregation of the Northeast, for example. People lived much more closely in proximity to one another. What the suburbanization of the New Orleans metro area did was, one, drastically change the multiracial nature of the city. So while there was always a very large black population in the city, 54%, we know that by 2000 that became 67% black. So it went from, I'm sorry, it was at 40, blah, 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 blah. Oh, wait, I actually don't have the number up there, but it was actually slightly less than half. The black population was slightly less than half before 1970, and shoots up to 67% after. That increase is not because black folk got very fertile. It's because white folk moved to the suburbs. So that was fundamentally about a shift in where people were living. That represented not just a population shift. The jobs followed the suburbanizing population. And that's a story that's happening all over the country. It's not just New Orleans. There are whole lots of reasons for that, some of them racial, obviously explicitly about racism, but some of it is about the incentive structures, right? Where you get the subsidies to locate your jobs. And all that gets reinforced by the way we do race. So the schools are going to be better in the suburbs because there's coded messages around schools are better if white people are in them, right? We have to be honest about that. That's not about whether the people who send their kids to those schools are bad or racist people, but there's no question that we have an unconscious evaluation of quality based on racial makeup. We start to shift that when we live in proximity with one another. We reinforce it when we separate. So if we look at the job pattern, so not only did population relocate, city had 2/3 of the region's jobs in 1970, but by 2000 it had 42% of the region's jobs. So as I said, these are structural. These aren't about attitudes, although attitudes get produced by the structures. So what I don't have up here, because it's still hard to get good numbers on this, but if we look at pre-hurricane Latino in-migration, and this is also true of a lot of urban areas, Latino in-migration was by and large going to the suburbs, which is not surprising, because if you're new immigrating population, you're going to go to where the job growth is, right? You're going there, and by and large in this country, particularly Latino population, is coming to be in the service economy. And that service economy is being driven out of the suburbs, with the exception, of course, of tourism in the center of the city. But so the demographics were showing greater increase in Latino population in the suburbs pre-hurricane. And we know post-hurricane, there's also tremendous growth within the city itself. So I've already made this point, but here's what's really important about these structures that I'm talking about suburbanization, about the hyper increase in segregation that has produced, about the resource allocation and the fundamental imbalance of how resources get distributed based on those structures. So resources going to the suburbs over the cities, for example, is we have a psychological phenomenon that social psychologists will call in-grouping and out-grouping. And we do it naturally as a human race. We have chosen in this country to define in-group and out-group along these socially and structurally developed racial lines. And as I've said, our process in this country has been to have constant debates and arguments about who's in what group. And is it biological or is it just cultural? what it's come to mean is both. We've kind of biologized and culturalized race. So we talk about certain groups as being culturally challenged or needing to work on their culture if they're going to have opportunities, so black folk, they have a culture of poverty. We hear that all the time, right? The black community could just deal with its culture of poverty. And Latinos, if you could just learn English for God's sake, then you would. So, we have this debate that there is a cultural dimension to it. And if you think about the immigration debates, if you think about what happened when we saw tens of thousands of immigrants, particularly Mexican, organizing and developing a real protest movement around their membership in U.S. society, around the recognition that they are members, that they contribute, and that they have as much right to be here as anyone else. One of the things that happened was you started to have Latino kids who were going to schools wrapped in the American flag being punished for wrapping themselves in the American flag. You're not American. And then when Latino students in the Bay Area marched with Mexican flags, then the attack was, see, you're not loyal to this country because we don't permit any kind of dual identity. So we both demand the assimilation, right? We demand you have to be as much like the dominant us. But by the way, we still won't completely admit you, even if you do that. But you have to take on as much of our culture that will make us feel comfortable with you. But we won't necessarily change the structures of how we distribute opportunity once you've done that. So this is the conversation that we're really having right now around immigration. It's the same conversation that we're having across, I would argue, Black and Latino, which is two groups that fundamentally have been denied membership. And I really want to stress this point. So we talk about citizenship. When we're talking about the legal process of citizenship, one of the things we have to understand is right now, while it is incredibly important to have and be able to contest and say you are a citizen of the country and get all the legal benefits that come with citizenship, citizenship in this country has never translated into membership. And the African American community in this country is the perfect example. So what the civil rights movement was fundamentally a movement about recognition of black citizenship, our right to vote, our right to attend schools, our right to participate in the democracy of this country. And now what we won was the legal recognition of our citizenship. How included did black folk in this room feel in this country? In this substantive democracy of this country, in the opportunities of this country? I would argue that most blacks still feel highly excluded, like we are not members yet. And I think part of that then drives the tension with the Latino community, who are contesting for citizenship, understandably and rightly. So what we have to see is, how are we all going to become members? Recognizing that we have to have citizenship struggles, recognizing that the legal issues are important, but also recognizing that that's not the end of the fight. This is an important frame. We are talking about becoming a membership society, not an ownership society. A membership society in which we all are members of this democracy, which includes the legal recognition, but it has to include a lot more. So if we think about this in-grouping and out-grouping, a lot of it is driven by the way we've done race and what else? The other important contextual issue, scarcity. So if you think about the tensions between groups, and this, by the way, includes the tension between people of color and white people in this country today. What's happening with the middle class? How's it doing? Y'all feel good? Because I know we're all middle class in this room, probably, or most of us. Most of us are feeling squeezed. Squeezed. The wealth gap and the income gap in this country is astounding, and it's growing. And it is race neutral in the sense that middle class whites are deeply squeezed. deeply squeezed. Job security no longer exists. Health care is no longer a given, even if you're in the middle class. The educational system is broken. The number of higher education slots are actually shrinking at a time when the only way you can really compete in this globalizing economy is with a minimum of a BA. A high school degree doesn't cut it anymore. Now, we also know people of the color are still at the bottom of that squeeze. I mean, we're still deep down in the sub-basement, but increasingly white middle class is getting pushed into the basement. But the penthouse is getting a lot swanker. They got a few more levels. The plasma TVs are getting bigger. The cars are getting bigger. So what that really means is we have to think fundamentally about the opportunity that creates. I mean, we often talk about scarcity as our challenge, and it is a challenge, because in the context of the civil rights movement, if you remember, that was a context of abundance. That was a time when the economy was growing, job security. People were feeling really confident about the country, except for the Vietnam War, but there was, economically certainly, there was a real confidence. We had produced the middle class in the past 20 years. We had actually produced a large, vibrant middle class. And blacks were contesting to entry into that middle class. And there was some room there because there was abundance. Now we're in a time of scarcity. We are not in a time of abundance. So we have to rethink our strategies, and this goes back to Multiracial Coalition Alliance. We have to rethink our strategies because in the context of scarcity, it is very easy to divide across this in-group, out-group, which in our country means race. So it's very easy for the right to come to black churches and say Latinos are taking your jobs. It's very easy. It's very easy for Latinos to hear that they're lucky, they just have to work hard, not like the lazy black folk. It is very easy for Asians to essentially be conferred, privileged minority status, yet still be discriminated against, but be told, we're a little more comfortable with you, distance yourself from those other folk. So we have to literally think about how the scarcity can actually drive opportunity for a different conversation about race, the structure of exclusion that it is promoting, including for white people. Public education system is broken because we built it on race. We're the only industrialized nation in the world that funds our K through 12 education system locally. That's a direct result of racial segregation in the schools and segregating the resources around the racial geography. We haven't changed that because we haven't changed race. And we haven't changed how we do that geography. And white folk are getting hurt by that too. And so this is the conversation we have to start to have. And we have to have it in the context of policy. So I'm not going to go through the rest of what I have here because I've basically said it. We have to think about leadership. The ingredients to the house is we must have leaders that recognize the value of multiracial alliance. Where we have had that, we have produced some vibrant successes. There's some in Los Angeles, there's some in Brooklyn, New York, there's some really interesting early formations in Mississippi, where people are starting to win policies and opportunities because leadership recognized the need to come together. And when I'm talking about leadership, I'm not talking about electeds. I'm talking about community leaders, people who are either running local civic organizations, but across with their own credibility and commitment to their constituencies. This isn't an assimilationist model, but who recognize the value of connectedness and collectivity and the value of working together across those groups. But they have to be credible in their communities because they have to be able to provide the leadership that helps their own communities that are feeling a lot of tension over working together across these lines. They have to provide the leadership for why and how and the process that permits it. But the second thing is there always has to be institutions that support it. So we need more thinking about what are the policy ideas that start to dismantle the structures that are driving the socialization of race and the racial division. and therefore the opportunity problems that we have in the country. And we need that to go directly to the ground and feed and support the ground in terms of those ideas so that the people and leaders on the ground can take it to a different level, because in each local context it has to be done differently. There's no cookie cutter here. The next, and it has to be resourced, obviously. The other component that's critical is the framing. And this is why I go back to the history. This is why I go back to what are we really about in this country? What does democracy really mean? And what does it mean to talk well about race and racial hierarchy? So I tend to think about this a lot right now in the context of Black Latino. It's not obviously the only or most important area. It's got to be thought of more broadly. But just in the context of Black Latino, going to this issue of membership. We're all struggling for membership in this society, and we are being played off of each other. And we all need housing, and we all need schools, and we all need health care, and we all need jobs. So the framing is critical. We must create the policy solutions that recognize race but are universal in their impact. All communities must benefit, and they won't unless we recognize how race is operating, and we target benefits to communities of color. So those are the hows, and I don't have time to do it, and I know I'm probably going over time. There are lots of examples of where this is starting to happen, and I'm happy to share them later with anyone who wants to know. But thank you.